I looked at the recruiting rankings for the last 4 years, looked at the records of the conference and overall records of these teams for the last 4 years, and it's not going to shock you because you're all over this stuff that Bama's here, and then there's a precipitous drop after that. Even teams like LSU, you think LSU, you think national power. LSU's 14-10 in the league the last 3 seasons. Florida's actually got the second best record in the SEC in conference games over the last 3 years at 17-7. Tennessee's been recruiting Butch Jones out of his mind for 4 years, and he's 12-12. Georgia's got the second best overall record in the last 3 years at 28-11. The recruiting's been there for some of the programs that I mentioned, but we're just not seeing those 2 or 3 or 4 teams rank in the top 5 to 15 in the country like we were 5 years ago.
Right, and I guess you really point the finger at coaching. That's one reason Les Miles was fired. That's why Mark Richt was fired. You mentioned the recruiting rankings. Those guys not getting it done, and they were shown the door. So that's exactly what happens when you set these high expectations and because of recruiting classes and then not perform September through December. It happened time and time again, and that's why those 2 big coaches were fired. Steve Spurrier decided he couldn't, do it anymore. He couldn't recruit with the best of them. He couldn't coach to the best of his ability at South Carolina. And South Carolina brings in a retread, a guy who was not successful at Florida, who recruited very well. But once we go back and look at it, and Will Muschamp at Florida only recruited well on one side of the ball. That did him in there at Florida. McElwain comes in, and recruiting wasn't what we've known it to be for Florida standards, but yet somehow still wins the East. That's why Tennessee is now having Butch Jones on the hot seat. You mentioned his recruiting classes. He's underperforming. So it just seems to be the trend. And, Mark, that's what you're pointing to is these recruiting classes are there, but it's not the performance on Saturdays.
Yeah, we saw the numbers after National Signing Day, and the numbers haven't changed. The numbers are the same. A third of ESPN's top 300 players still go to the SEC. So the other 4 major conferences share the other 67%. Usually the Big Ten comes in a woeful second to the SEC. So we're still seeing the flood of talent into the SEC, and then 3 to 4 years later, it leaves to go to the NFL. So we're still seeing the league dominate recruiting. Then 3 or 4 years later, the league dominate in the NFL draft. And I don't want to be an alarmist to say, oh, the SEC's been horrible on the field, because that would be ridiculous. It's just gone to where it was clearly the best to, okay, there's an argument here. There's the Big Ten, there's the ACC. It's an argument. And in addition to the coaching, and maybe an underrated coaching loss for the SEC was Gary Pinkel over the last few years. Obviously, what he did at Missouri, despite the East being down at the time, was pretty impressive. And now Mizzou is just kind of in the abyss in that, 50 to 80 range nationally.
Yeah, I guess the question for them is, would they have been able to keep it up? I mean, his last year there, Missouri was not on par with what they were doing previously when they were going to SEC championships. And, and it's been the continued trend. Part of the problem is when the East gets there, it's not performing well in Atlanta. So, yes, the recruiting is still there for the most part, not going much. We saw even Georgia this past recruiting cycle, land a top 3 class, and we'll see what Kirby Smart can do with that. Is he another Will Muschamp? Is he another guy who's bringing in classes and can't perform on Saturdays? That remains to be seen when we are talking about Georgia right now. So they were not on par. They had a disappointing season, no matter if it was Kirby Smart's first season or not. They were a bit disappointing when you look at the grand scheme of things, and losing to Georgia Tech at the end of the year. It's you have to look, I think, at coaching, as I mentioned earlier, and where the now top tier coaches are at. You wouldn't say they're in the SEC. You mentioned guys. They're coming in through recruiting, and then they're going on to the NFL. Nothing's changed there. What you have to look at is the coaching. So with these new wave of coaches, can Jim McElwain, once he starts recruiting better at Florida, can he give Alabama more of a run for their money if they reach the SEC championship game? Can Kirby Smart live up to the expectations while he's recruiting well? Can Butch Jones find a way to, look at Tennessee, what they did under Peyton Manning. They didn't win much under Peyton Manning. It was a year after Peyton Manning left, they win the national title. Is that a similar scenario that maybe happens this year? Is Tennessee a surprise team where, okay, maybe all the stars have gone and now they're a better team the year after? That's what you're looking at in the East, I think, this year with Florida, Georgia, and Tennessee. Can those guys, that's part of the reason the SEC's down. The success has come in the West, and it's not has come in the East. Can the East close the gap? And you're looking from the past 2 years, Florida's leading that wave right now. They have to get closer.
Yeah, David, LSU seems to be at first thought, at least my poster child for underachieving. But Auburn and Georgia right there, I'm looking at the last 4 recruiting classes. They have never failed to be in the top 10, either one of them. Georgia, number 8, 5, 8, and 3 the last 4 years in 24/7's top rankings. And Auburn, 6, 8, 9, and 9. They've never missed the top 10 recruiting class for either Georgia or Auburn. And you're looking at Auburn going 8 and 5, 7 and 6, 8 and 5. While the talent's been there consistently, coming in and leaving, maybe the quarterback play, though, maybe that's been the one spot that hasn't held up since that Mettenberger, Manziel, Murray, McCarron class left in 2013.
Yeah, that's been the final year. I think we could say SEC has had a quarterback-driven league. It's not been that way since then, and you've seen Florida struggle since Tim Tebow has left. You mentioned LSU even struggled before Mettenberger, struggled since Mettenberger. It was just that 1 year in 2012 that LSU was able to do something with him. Alabama, even though their quarterbacks aren't great, they are fitting them to a system that just really works for them. It seems like these other programs really just can't do that for whatever reason. Part of it is, Bama surrounding those quarterbacks with such good players along the offensive line and at running back and at wide receiver. It makes it easier for those guys. Florida's dropped off in recruiting to where, yes, they're getting their 4 stars, but instead of complimenting the 4 stars with 5 stars, they're complimenting the 4 stars with 3 stars. That's why Florida has fell off in recent years, and that's why we don't see Florida being able to hang with FSU at the end of the year and Alabama in the SEC championship game. Florida's not getting the elites. So when you start looking at the program that Florida is and trying to compare that, it's the quarterback position that's holding them back. As we mentioned, that's where we're going into this conversation and not getting the elites. But you look at the young talent that you have. Can Felipe Franks or Kyle Trask do something for Florida? We have Jacob Eason coming back for Georgia. Can he progress into his second season and be the quarterback everybody thinks he's going to be? Jake Bentley in South Carolina, who will be taken, from the second half of his first season to where he looked pretty good. Can he take that next step and be one of, Will Muschamp didn't have a lot of success at Florida with quarterbacks. Is this one he finally hits on and the quarterback goes from there? Kentucky's got some good quarterback competition going into next year. So I thought we saw toward the end of last year, the SEC East might find their next tier and wave of quarterbacks. How successful can they be? That still remains to be seen.